Do you think you know your friends and family well enough that they would never do you harm? Think again, because as today's tale will shock how frightening blindly trusting anyone can be. Do you enjoy listening to tales about the wicked and the dark? Then you will love this story. Let's get right into it. In the small town of Willow Creek, the disappearance of George Miller was the subject of discussion for weeks. George was a well-respected member of the community, known for his generous nature and kind heart. He was a successful businessman, owning a hardware store that had been a staple in the town for over 3 decades. His disappearance had sent shockwaves through the town, leaving his family and friends devastated and the community in a state of confusion. Nobody knew what had happened to him, and as the days turned into weeks, hope for his safe return began to dwindle. It was a typical Saturday morning when George was last seen. He had closed up his store and headed out to run some errands. His wife Susan expected him back in time for lunch, but he never showed up. When she tried calling his phone, it went straight to voicemail. At first, she assumed he had just gotten held up, but as the hours passed, her worry grew. Susan contacted the police that evening, and they launched an investigation into George's disappearance. They questioned his family, friends, and employees, but nobody had seen or heard from him since that Saturday morning. The police searched his store, home, and car, but there were no signs of a struggle or foul play. The town was in shock. George was involved in many acts of charity around town, and he always had a smile on his face. His disappearance was like a dent in the town's history, and people began to speculate about what could have happened to him. Some people thought he had run away, while others believed he had been kidnapped. There were even rumors that he had been murdered, but there was no evidence to support any of these theories. As the investigation continued, tensions in the town grew. People were worried about their safety, and the disappearance had left a feeling of unease hanging over the community. Even the town's annual Fall Festival, which was usually a joyous occasion, was marked by a sense of sadness and fear. For the people of Willow Creek, life would never be the same again. Despite the initial confusion and lack of clues surrounding George Miller's disappearance, the police investigation eventually started to bear fruit. In the days following his disappearance, a few witnesses came forward with important information that the police had not yet considered. One of George's neighbors reported seeing a strange vehicle parked outside his house on the morning he disappeared. The vehicle was a black van, and the neighbor noted that it had no license plate. The van's driver appeared to be a man, but the neighbor could not see his face as he was wearing a baseball cap and sunglasses. The police immediately began searching for the mysterious black van, but it was nowhere to be found. However, the neighbor's account provided the first significant clue in the investigation, giving the police a lead to follow. Another key piece of information came from George's assistant, who mentioned that George had been acting strangely in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. He had been receiving phone calls at odd hours of the night, and he had seemed more distracted than usual. She could not say who was calling him, but she remembered overhearing him mention something about a business deal that he was not entirely comfortable with. The police dug deeper into George's business dealings and discovered that he had been negotiating a large sale with a potential buyer from out of town. The deal was worth several $1 million, and while it had not yet been finalized, the buyer had already transferred a significant amount of money to George's account as a deposit. The police suspected that this deal may have something to do with George's disappearance, and they tried to investigate the buyer's background. Unfortunately, they couldn't find anything other than a name that didn't have any history, apparently. With this new information in hand, the police began focusing their investigation on the potential buyer. They conducted raids on several locations, including a warehouse on the outskirts of town, but they couldn't find anything. The buyer was a man in his late 60s, and it didn't seem like he knew much about the deal. He even seemed a little bit senile. Despite their efforts, the police still had not found George Miller. They were working tirelessly, following up on every lead and continuing their search for the missing businessman. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months, the town of Willow Creek began to lose hope that George would ever be found alive. As the investigation into George Miller's disappearance continued, the case became more complicated when his assistant Emily also disappeared. Emily had been an essential witness in the case, providing the police with critical information about George's last days and his business dealings. Her sudden disappearance raised new concerns about the case and the safety of those involved. The police immediately launched an investigation into Emily's disappearance, but it quickly became apparent that the case was far more complex than they had initially thought. Emily's home had been ransacked, and her car was found abandoned on the outskirts of town. Her disappearance raised suspicion, especially given the context of George's disappearance. The investigation took a new turn when the police discovered that Emily had withdrawn a considerable amount of money from her bank account a few days before she disappeared. The police traced the withdrawal to a bank in a nearby town and found CCTV footage of Emily making the withdrawal. The footage also revealed that Emily had been accompanied by a man whom the police did not recognize. Her face was not clear as well, but she was recognized by her bright red hair and bouncy locks. The police worked on identifying the man in the footage, but their efforts proved fruitless. The man had disguised himself with a hoodie and a baseball cap, making it almost impossible to identify him. The case became more complicated as the police followed leads, and some of them led to dead ends. The people of the town became more and more concerned for their own safety. It was clear that George and Emily's disappearances were not ordinary, and whoever was behind them was willing to do whatever it took to cover their tracks. The police continued their search, but despite their best efforts, they were no closer to finding George or Emily. The town was in disarray, and other rumours began to spread about what had happened to the two missing individuals. As the investigation dragged on, the town of Willow Creek began to accept the grim reality that George and Emily might never be found. The disappearance of two well-respected members of the community had left a significant impact on the town's psyche, and things would never be the same again. As the investigation into the disappearances of George Miller and his assistant, Emily, continued, something even more bizarre happened. Susan Miller, George's wife, went missing. This was the third disappearance in a row, and the police were baffled. Susan had been cooperating with the police in the investigation, and her sudden disappearance raised new concerns about the safety of those involved. The police immediately launched a search for Susan, but their efforts proved fruitless. Her car was found abandoned on a deserted road outside of town, and there were no signs of a struggle or foul play. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. The police quickly realized that Susan's disappearance was not a coincidence. There was a connection between the three missing persons, and they were dealing with something far more sinister than they had initially thought. The police went back to the drawing board and re-examined all the evidence they had gathered so far. They looked for any links between the three missing persons and found that all of them had some connection to George's business dealings. The police began to dig deeper into George's business affairs, and it became apparent that the potential buyer with whom George had been negotiating the sale was connected to a powerful and dangerous criminal organization. The police suspected that the organization was involved in the disappearances of George, Emily, and Susan. The investigation became more complicated as the police tried to uncover the truth. They conducted raids on several locations and arrested several individuals who were believed to be involved in the criminal organization. However, they were still unable to find any concrete evidence linking the organization to the disappearances. As the investigation continued, the town of Willow Creek was on edge. The disappearances had left a lasting impact on the community, and people were afraid to go out alone at night. The police had increased patrols, but they were no closer to finding the missing persons. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and there was still no sign of George, Emily, or Susan. The town had become a ghost town, with many people leaving to avoid being caught up in the ongoing investigation. The police were working tirelessly, following up on every lead and continuing their search for the missing persons. They knew that time was running out, and they needed to find them before it was too late. One of the police officers thought about looking into Susan's past, and his intuition got him a lead of some sorts. It looks like Susan had a criminal record. It wasn't something major, but nevertheless they had to look it up. Seems like when she was younger, she was running with a rough crowd. And by rough crowd, we mean a criminal organization. She was only 19 at the time, and you might say that she was young and impressionable. The offence referred to a robbery. She was sent into the store as bait to not raise any suspicions, and as the clerk was relaxed enough, two men came inside and emptied the cash register. They found this piece of information quite interesting. So a small crew of officers were sent to investigate the place where it all happened. That evening, after a 3-hour drive, they arrived in the town where Susan grew up. They already knew that she didn't have a family anymore, apart from her husband, so their only stop was at the local police station. But on the way there, they saw something quite shady on the street corner. Two men, dressed in black, with hoodies on their heads, were talking to each other quite aggressively. Wanting to see how things play out, the officers parked their car so that they wouldn't be seen and waited patiently. Not long after that, another man appeared. He was also dressed in black, but what set him apart from the other two was the fact that he was holding a briefcase. The officers knew that something illegal was going on, but they waited for the exchange of goods. Just as they suspected, one of the men went into a dark alley and took Brawl with him another briefcase. He opened it, and it was as clear as day that they were selling drugs, and a large amount for that matter. That was their signal. As soon as the drugs and the money were exchanged, the police officers pounced on the criminals and apprehended them. It wasn't long until one of the criminals told the men of law whatever they wanted to hear. They even got the name of the gang leader and his address. They took them to the station, but something didn't sit right. One of the criminals who gave his boss's name also mentioned that he had a wife, and her name sounded familiar. That made the Willow Creek officers go and investigate for themselves. They pulled up to the address with their headlights off and quietly got out of the car. They didn't have a warrant, but they got word from the local police station that one will be made momentarily. The house didn't look suspicious at all. And why would it if inside lived a gang leader? Of course, he didn't want to stand out. One of the officers kicked the door in. They pulled out their guns and ordered whoever was inside to get on the floor. But there were only two people, Maximus McGregor and a familiar face. Susan Miller. They couldn't believe it. The wife that had gone missing was there, and by the looks of it, she was living quite comfortably. She spent the night in jail, and the next morning she was taken back to Willow Creek. From the evidence the police gathered, it seemed that the people who was making deals with her husband was this gang leader, Susan's former lover. Also, the CTV footage of Emily withdrawing money turned out to be of Susan, who was wearing a wig. The prop was found inside McGregor's home. The two cunningly hatched a plan to get rid of him and take his money, thinking that it will end here and no one would be able to catch them. And if it wouldn't have been for that strange coincidence of the officers to see a drug exchange and for one of the criminals to mention a Susan, then they might have gotten away with it. This just goes to show you that you never know who the person right next to you actually is. After they were interrogated, the gang leader gave up the location of the two bodies. George and his assistant were found buried in a forest about 20 miles away from Susan's hometown, and plane tickets were also found. The couple was supposed to fly to Brazil in a couple of days. Susan already had a fake ID and the ticket was under her new name, Alison McGregor. The bodies were taken back to Willow Creek and the two got a proper burial. The entire town gathered to pay their respect, and as for the two, they got life in jail without any possibility of parole. Thank you for being frightened by today's wicked tale. If you want to be able to trust your family and friends ever again, make sure to subscribe or this might happen to you next.